came here from the Gulf Coast of Florida, I could say that you can expect actually an exodus from the other direction, away from the warm and wet places. All right, so I took the assignment seriously. I'm going to talk about my definition of place. So I'm going to talk about a concept of place networks that I've been toying with as some contemporary challenges of place and sense of place, and keys to the future of place. But I come at this as a sociologist who started out looking at the sociology of professions and cultural producers. And I started out in architecture school, actually, so I have a particular interest in the profession of architecture and the formation of professional authority. And that sort of migrated into an interest in the relationship between professional authority and democratic politics, right? So I'm gonna kind of work through this argument. As a sociologist, of course, I think of place as a socio-spatial phenomenon. I like that hyphenated notion. My friend Tom Guerin wrote once that place is space filled up by people, practices, objects, and representations. But I also like the other thing he said in that same piece, that design and serial construction of places is at the same time the execution of community, right? That we are building community when we're making places, right? I've also been trying to think about the relationship between that process of building community and that process of making, imagining, telling stories, giving form to places. So I really appreciate Tim's questioning of the very idea of creative placemaking, because to some extent, that's a lot of what my talk is about. Borrowing from Christopher Alexander, I really liked his idea that every place is given its character by certain patterns of events that keep on happening there. Joyce talked about the knowing how to go on. If you're in place, the insider's perspective. And then Alexander also wrote that these patterns of events are always interlocked with certain geometric patterns in space. And he thought you could analyze these in terms of a pattern language that could then inform design. Well, I really like that idea of pattern language. And it seemed to me that what he was trying to do was grasp for the way spatial geometry could become a constitutive part of social experience. It really resonated to me with this idea of the sociological imagination, an old C. Wright Mills concept that I used to teach all the time in intro sociology. This idea that the sociological imagination had to do with trying to grasp the relationship between biography and history. Your personal story and the story of, in the context. It seemed to me that our experience of place is fundamentally a kind of sociological imagination. It's a practical way to grasp living connections between the individual and the social, the private and the public. And it all gets manifested in the things we build as social relations in another form. And it seems to me that in the most idealized forms of this, as it becomes more self-aware, it defines a kind of civic imagination. I like this paired photos, by the way, of transformation of a plaza in Milan, because you can see very clearly that not only you have happy people, but even the trees are happier, right? That's really a telltale thing. So place is itself a social connection. And I like this idea of ecological networks. Browning and his colleagues actually looked at the idea that people frequenting the same places in their daily, what happened here? Yeah, okay. Frequenting the same places in their daily round, that in itself is a kind of social connection. There's a network of relationships that we're forming just by relating to place and having that mutual connection to place. So I agree with what Tony has said. I think that placemaking is really a fundamental process. And it's a fundamental part of how we construct the social world and experience our connections to the social world by experiencing commonness of that physical environment of place. That's where we encounter everything from the most mundane kinds of things to the most sacred, from the particular to the universal, private to public, from conflict and differences to shared understanding. All of that becomes embodied in this process of placemaking. So To think of creative placemaking is something I think we should really question as a specialized thing, because what we're doing all the time when we engage with each other is a process essentially of placemaking. I tried to start thinking about this in relationship to the problems of design. And I borrowed this idea of place networks from, I learned it first from a fellow named Michael Mahaffey. And it seemed to me this interesting idea that you have networks of relations between things intrinsic to places, but also that places themselves form this larger ecology. So you have relations between places, extrinsic to a place, and that these are constituted by relations at different levels of scale. But it's also a layering of relationships between elements that are in themselves complex entities, that pieces of those entities come into relationship with each other in kind of fluid and continually reconfigured ways. So the reason I'm using Cortona, Italy is because that's where I'm going next. So that's Cortona, Italy, the main piazza. So if you think about a piazza like this, you've got, first of all, this sort of defining space of the piazza. It relates to these other sort of connected places. You've got the people who sit in different places around the tables, sitting on the steps, looking at what's happening, passing through. You've got these kind of iconic elements of entrance into the Palazzo Pubblico, the clock and the bell tower, the bust. I'm not even sure who that is, but it reminds you that this place has a history. You've got all kinds of windows. The fenestration is hierarchically organized and relating to what's going on in different ways. Then you have the commercial elements. And all of this kind of layers up to create that sense of place, right? But the thing is that this web of relations between entities that have multiple attributes becomes layered because through space and through time, you have social activity, people moving, you have imagination, you have stories over time, right? So this is layering of social practice, spatial structures, physical objects is a really complex kind of phenomenon. And this going back to Chris Alexander, you had this idea in this old article that he wrote in 1965 of, I'm not going to go into the argument, which when I read it in the 70s, I didn't understand, had to go back to it and really figure out what he was talking about. But he has this one passage where he says, describing a place, the effect makes the news rack and the traffic light interactive. So you have news racks and traffic lights interacting, right? The news rack, the newspaper's on it, the money going from people's pockets to the dime slot, the dime, right? The people who stop at the light and read papers, the traffic light, the electric impulses which make lights change, the sidewalk which the people stand on, form a system. They all work together. So you have this like hybrid, heterogeneous network of things and people and processes and concepts. And it reminded me of the social construction of technology people who talk about actor networks as an attempt, as Michel Colon says, to provide analytical tools for explaining the very process by which society is constantly reconfigured, right? So place is comprised of all these entities that are not only complex, but heterogeneous. They're different. So you have these hybrid networks of physical forms, spatial patterns, behavioral tendencies, cultural schemas, social practices. So just like technology, places are society in the making. This is a phrase from Michel Colon. Okay, so holding that kind of complex idea aside for the moment, contemporary challenges. To me, the basic challenge is that places are typically now the result of an alienated process. The process of placemaking that's become increasingly objectified in this institutionally distributed set of agencies. At the intersection between public bureaucracy, democratic politics, market-oriented institutions. And this encompasses a range of things that are continually disrupting our connection to the making of places. That includes specialization in the professional division of labor, the various kinds of technical regulations that encourage a very narrow, siloed perspective about things. Many of the problems that we're trying to solve as quote placemakers are problems that were created by the last set of good ideas that were around. And we've also created a situation where public participation has become part of the problem and not a solution, because the forms of public participation are actually themselves disruptive and create exactly the wrong kinds of outcomes. So if we have non-places in the world, it has to do basically with the fact that we've increasingly created this placemaking technologies that is focused on creating places for a purpose. They focus on function rather than meaning. This is sort of the height of that, the multi-lane arterial like this. We create facilities, as the engineers say, rather than places, as opposed to creating the sort of more organic layering of places that you could map the way I did with the piazza in Cortona, where you have movement and activity, where lots of stuff is intersecting, right? And those are those organic places. And this is the reason why a lot of people say, oh, we can't make places on purpose, right? They just have to happen, right? So if that's the case, if places, and I've always struggled with this concept of authenticity, if an authentic place just has to happen organically, then architects and planners should just get the hell out of the business of placemaking, because it's, you know, it just disrupts what's going on. So where can this go? Where can we go as if we want to be designers and planners? First, understanding that places aren't just containers or collections of affordances, but things we do together. Emphasizing the making itself as a fundamental social process, not as something we have to call in, you know, specialists to work on. And it seems to me that, and this is from working with designers and planners, that urban form can actually support a vocabulary and a syntax of a shared spatial narrative. That's kind of the hopeful side of it. And in that context, design can play a key part, because what design essentially is a value-driven and intentional way of organizing our decisions, right? I like this discussion that Forrester has of design. And in this piece in 1988, he wrote that design is a process of making sense together in practical conversation. That's really different, by the way, from what I was taught about design in architecture school. And I also really like this idea of, you know, if you think about design as communicative action, he says, designing is both instrumentally productive and socially reproductive, accomplishing ends and reproducing social and political relations of status, power, and culture at the same time. So, you know, you can think of the designer as playing this role of reproducing things maybe that they don't always want to be reproducing. So that the warnings that I have for designers are often, first of all, you know, we need to not think of placemaking as a process of manipulating human psychology to produce some end, some outcome. We often have designers who want research to tell them how they can manipulate experience to create the experiences that they want. I think we have to be wary of that kind of determinism and the authority of generalized knowledge that professionals are often seeking from psychologists, sociologists, and experts. We have to avoid that dogmatism of form following function. If form is part of that conversation about practical things, it should be focused on as conversation. So it's not a process of envisioning and then delivering. You know, the envisioning and the delivering should be part of the same process, you know, co-production. And design should itself be imagined as a process of building relationships so that those relationships are embodied in the outcome. And so that as you finish project, as the proposal goes forward, as the design is finalized, the story that people are telling about the thing that is being created comes to be sort of, they don't necessarily tell the same stories, but they have kind of converging stories about why things are as they are. Rather than what most people look around the built environment and they see a lot of stuff that they think just happens that way. Maybe because that's the way engineering says it has to happen. So we need to think about reconfiguring a lot of the institutional structures relevant to the way we build. And they're very difficult to change. Sharon talked about sort of the flows of capital, the bureaucratic regulatory system, the structure of division of labor between the professions. Retooling the regulatory apparatus means actually having to rethink what it means to try to sustain the meaningful diversity of places over time. And think about design as more basis for collaborative and vision-based planning. And as, having the goal of reconstructing a kind of civic democracy. So I think placemaking fundamentally has to do with facilitating self-conscious engagement with our socio-spatial setting, and ideally turning that experience of ecological networks into a civic public realm. And that doesn't mean that everybody sort of comes to happy consensus. The civic public realm encompasses conflict and difference, encompasses struggle, but it encompasses struggle in a way that makes that struggle potentially at least productive. And so the three goals that I came up with are, first of all, the goal of resilience, the idea of building a political culture that allows for people to be comfortable with change, allows them to imagine the possibility of managing continuity while things are changing. And it seems to me that's an essential part of democratic practice. The second thing is the idea of honoring difference and developing an approach to the way we organize territory that actually gets past structuring control around the inequities of class, race, and gender. And then finally, cultivating that sense of agency in placemaking. And that is going to require